In this second video about multi-method research, I'm going to talk about one particular combination of methods that I think is very powerful and useful, but has been neglected. And I want to use this as an example of how sometimes research tends to neglect some combinations of methods for reasons of the sociology and history of different disciplines and how they think about methods. So I think there's a missed opportunity here that some people are starting to take up finally in a very useful way. And this is what I call computer-assisted discourse analysis. Okay, so in an article in the journal Millennium, I categorized different journals in my own field of international relations into journals that are more interpretive and journals that are more seeking causal explanatory knowledge and hypothesis testing, things of that nature, causal inference, and journals that are more qualitative in their methodology and more quantitative in their methodology. And you'll notice here that there are journals in three of those four quadrants. So there are interpretive qualitative journals like Millennium and European Journal of International Relations. There are causal explanatory and qualitative journals like International Security and Security Studies that do a lot of case study research with the goal of causal inference. And then there are lots of quantitative journals that are causal explanatory. So Journal of Conflict Resolution, Journal of Peace Research, right? But notice there are no interpretive quantitative journals, right? And there's no logical or methodological reason that that should be an empty cell. We can use quantitative analysis even for interpretive purposes. There's a whole book by Laura Soberg and Sammy Barkin, which does exactly that, highlights this particular combination. But there's no journal that really specializes in that kind of work. Moreover, if we look at which journals typically cite, we find that journals are citing other journals in their same quadrant all the time. Sometimes they're citing across the rows, so the qualitative journals that are more interpretive sometimes cite the ones that are more causal explanatory. They cite across the columns, so the causal explanatory ones that are qualitative sometimes cite the quantitative ones and vice versa. But there's almost no citations across the diagonal. So the quantitative causal explanatory journals are almost never citing the qualitative interpretive journals and vice versa. Okay, and to me that's a problem. It's a missed opportunity. So this slide just shows some of the data. Again, we see the ones in the same quadrant citing each other many times. In the columns and across the method rows, we see them citing a fair amount, right? And across the diagonal, very few, right? So one casualty of that is computer-assisted discourse analysis. Now this slide shows computer-assisted content analysis, which has emerged out of the quantitative methods research program. And so here what we do is we take texts, could be books, articles, news articles, speeches, any kind of text, and we can gather together a lot of these, we can digitize them, and then we can do two kinds of search. One is called a directed search, where we feed into the computer the terms that we're looking for, and the other is an undirected search, where we just ask the computer to divide up these texts or documents into categories that are where the documents in that category are similar to each other. That's an undirected or more, more inductive kind of a search, right? Now, the authors of this article, this is taken from an article in the journal Political Analysis. Justin Grimmer and Brandon Stewart are the authors of this. And they argue that, in this kind of analysis, when we combine content analysis from computers with old-fashioned discourse analysis or content analysis where we actually read the documents, that we should take into account, all the traditional things about the context and the power relationships and institutions and so on. Okay. Now, in a later article, and this is an example I want you to think about, Stewart, who's one of the authors of the article that had the previous slide, the previous graph, did a computer-assisted content analysis with a co-author, Zhukov, and it was in 2009, and they were studying the discourse on foreign policy among Soviet military and civilian leaders for the previous 20 years or so. And so my question for you is, if you're following Stuart's advice and trying to pay attention to context and politics and institutions, what are the key issues that you would want to discuss or address in this article that give you the context to understand the categories that the computer is giving you about military and civilian leaders? So take a few minutes and write down some ideas about that in the Google Doc if you're doing a class with me, and then return to this same video. We'll continue after you do that exercise. So hit pause for a second, and then I'm going to make some concluding comments about this. Okay, so computer-assisted discourse analysis is particularly useful for several things. One is if you have huge amounts of digital text, it can help you make sense of that. It can help you pick which documents to look at more closely yourself with a human reading. I find it kind of odd that sometimes you'll talk to somebody who does discourse analysis where they read everything themselves, and you say, well, why don't you consider using computer-assisted content analysis to help you in your discourse analysis? And they say, oh, wait, I would never do that. That's a terrible idea. Computers can't do analysis. And then you say, well, do you ever use Google Scholar? And they say, well, I couldn't live without Google Scholar. I use it all the time. Well, what do you think Google Scholar is? It's a computer-assisted content analysis. You're using it to help you decide which text to even pay attention to in the scholarly discourse, right? So there's a little bit of a disconnect to say I use Google Scholar all the time and I would never do a computer-assisted content analysis, right? So when you have massive amounts of text that would take you forever to go through as a human reader, you can make some sense of the text with a computer, and then that'll help you identify which documents are worth your time to read personally yourself and interpret. It's great for identifying framing. Who was the first person to use a certain phrase? Who picked up that phrase? Who argued against it? And so on. So there's a lot of phrases or framing in political life: pro-life, pro-choice, Black Lives Matter, environmental sustainability, and we could try to trace, where do these terms come from, and how does the meaning that people attach to them evolve over time. We could look at agenda setting. Who's the first to push an idea and who follows that? Who gets to set the agenda? Who defines the issues that people talk about in the way that they talk about them? We can assess silences. We can assess the things that are ignored or not talked about. The elephants in the living room. We can also assess the salience, what things are important by how frequently they're mentioned. In a study with one of my then graduate students, we looked at why different leaders in Iraq were able to sustain collective violence and others were not. Muqtada Sadr was somebody that you could see was ignored for many months in the U.S. media. The U.S. first paid attention to a guy named Chabani, who was an exile who turned out not to be very influential in Iraq. And then they paid attention to a religious leader named Sistani, but then he refused to get involved in politics. And then suddenly, very late, they finally became aware that the one person that was really going to be a powerful player was Muqtada Sadr, who was able to mobilize entire militia for a long period of time. So we could just trace how frequently it was mentioned, and we could show that the U.S. had neglected this powerful player while it was paying too much attention to other actors who, in the end, either didn't have or didn't exercise much power. So, like I said, we can find the blank spots where something used to be talked about and isn't anymore. We can find the elephant in the living room, the things that nobody's openly talking about, but that we think everybody's thinking about because other evidence, maybe interviews or things where people mention things that are otherwise taboo. We can show the disconnect between the public discourse and the private discourse, right? We can assess power, the way that actors use language for what we call rhetorical coercion to try to box in the options that other players have. One example in some work I've done with one of my graduate students looks at how the U.S. and China use certain language to try to structure the relationship they have and to try to limit the options of the other side. The U.S. says China should be a responsible stakeholder and provide, their contributions to global public goods. And China says, well, we're a poor developing country. We just want a peaceful rise. And then other times China says, we are a great world power. We deserve to be treated that way. So there's a lot of complicated discourse there. Okay, so that's one combination I think there's a lot of opportunities for, and it's been a little bit neglected because the computer community doesn't co-author very much with the interpretivist discourse analysis community, and I think there's a lot of common, a good purpose if they find some common ground and work together. But there are many other methods we could put in the mix: focus groups, lab experiments, field experiments, surveys, survey experiments, agent-based modeling, network analysis. You know, with so many different methods, there are many different combinations of things that you can do with your research. And often the best way to figure out how to do that is to find an example of somebody who's done it, because there's so many potential combinations that there's no one book that deals with all the potential combinations of methods that you could have. So it's best to just find somebody who did it well and then sort of learn from how they did their particular mix of methods. Okay, so research is all about trade-offs. Methods have different comparative advantages. That's why there's a lot of value to be added in combining them in careful ways. This can contribute to both better theoretical knowledge and to more policy relevant knowledge.